Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the upcoming Fox 3 missiles for War Thunder. I'm definitely interested in them as I've made a couple of videos on the topic, but I wanted to cover what Fox 2 missiles will be added to the game in the future. The majority of the missiles I'll be covering likely won't be in the game for a few years, but I still can pretty much guarantee that at the very least all, but maybe one or two at the most, will be added. I had talked about it before, but a lot of people really don't think about how these missiles will come at some point and change the game. Soon, medium-range Fox 3s will be added to every nation in War Thunder, and likely not too far in the future, we will start receiving even better ones that will also change the meta even more in my opinion. Those Fox 3s, in addition to these advanced shorter range IR missiles, will mean that the new top tier will be played a bit differently, though it will depend on how Gaijin implements some of these missiles and how strong they actually make them. Before I get into the specifics of each missile, I want to mention a few things. First off, I made sure to get as much accurate information as I could when doing research for this video. However, just due to the simple fact that these are all pretty modern weapons and most of them are still being used, there is minimal information to begin with, let alone multiple sources for the same thing. Fortunately, there was a decent enough amount of information on most missiles, but notably there was an even more significant lack of information on both Chinese and Japanese missiles, some information which could be basically only found on Wikipedia, which already has small amounts of information as it was. Also, all of the gimbal limits I mentioned throughout this video are the maximum off-bore sight angles to the best of my knowledge, and they all should be able to go past that angle after launch to keep track of their target. Lastly, I would like to thank both Freezing Cold and Caden Cantrell for being members. Thank you both for all of your support. The first missile we have is the AIM-9X. Notably, there were two major blocks, as the AIM-9X Block 3 was cancelled by the US Navy in 2016. The AIM-9X Block 1 is a significant upgrade over the AIM-9M in almost every way. The few ways in which it is similar is that it uses the same motor and the same warhead. While it does use the same motor, it has a longer range due to its slightly lighter weight, but also its significantly lower drag. The gimbal limit is much higher at 90 degrees off bore sight, which, in addition to a maximum overload of 60 Gs and thrust vectoring, means it is able to perform much better in a dogfight than the Sidewinder before it. The thrust vectoring on the 9X is notably a bit different than a lot of other missiles in that it vectors the fins, which also vectors the thrust, whereas many other thrust vectoring missiles vector the nozzle alone. Another major upgrade is that the Seeker is infrared imaging, which essentially means it is an infrared camera. What this does is allow the Seeker to tell in between the plane and flares so that it is easier to reject the countermeasures. As for the upgraded Block 2, there were a few slightly different variants, but these were just software differences from what I know, so it would probably be best just to use the most recent version. The 9X Block 2 has everything from the Block 1 with improved flare rejection, lock-on after launch with data link, and lofting for even more improved ranges. Lock-on after launch was primarily added for use with aircraft such as the F-22 so that they could be fired from the internal bay without a lock first. They are able to open the bay and just fire the missile, and it will be initially guided with data link until its Seeker can lock the target. As for lofting, this was added so that the gap between the range of the Sidewinder and the AMRAAM could be slightly smaller, so that at shorter ranges the 9X could be used over the AIM-120 if the enemy were to be jamming the Seeker of the AMRAAM. The 9X can be launched from quite a lot of platforms, some of which include the F-15C, E, and EX, the F-16, the F-A-18 Super Hornet, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35, just to name a few. The 9X is one of the few missiles that I think we could see sometime this year, and most likely the end of the year at the earliest though. This will definitely be a very good missile and a nice upgrade over the 9M, but not quite as good as some of the others like this next one I'm about to mention. The IRIS-T, not to be confused with IRST, which is a technology already found on some planes in War Thunder, is a missile that was jointly developed by a few different countries, primarily Germany, Italy, and Sweden. In comparison, the IRIS-T was introduced in 2005, just 2 years after the 9X, yet it is quite a lot better in many aspects. The maximum range of the IRIS-T is 25 kilometers, though the effective range is generally known to be less than many of the other modern IR missiles and is primarily better in a dogfight than most other missiles. The IRIS-T has a thrust vectoring motor and an absolutely insane maximum overload of 100 Gs. As for the Seeker, it also has thermal imaging, which allows for much better flare resistance. It also has an off-bore sight gimbal limit of about 90 degrees and notably can loop back around if it misses a target on the first pass to hit. As for aircraft that can carry the IRIS-T, these include the Gripen, the Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-16, and the KF-21. This is just a very short list of planes that can and have carried it, but technically it should be able to be used with any plane that has a launcher capable of firing an AIM-9L. Gaijin will probably only give it to planes that were specifically designated to carry it, as that is how they typically handle things in games, and it seems to make sense at least when they follow their own guidelines that they claim to have. Overall, the IRIS-T is definitely going to be one of the hardest missiles to avoid, especially at closer ranges. I think of all the more advanced missiles, this definitely will be coming a bit later and almost certainly after the 9X. Next up, we have the Chinese PL-10, which is basically an IRIS-T from Wish. If you take a look at this picture, you can see the similarities between the two, and while not the exact same, it doesn't exactly seem to be a completely homegrown design either. Of course, this is just speculation, but the fact that the development began just a year before the IRIS-T entered service is a bit interesting. As for notable features, I have a bit of a smaller list here. Not that this missile is just all around worse, though that could be the case. There's just less information, as the Chinese government is a lot better at keeping secrets than other nations. This also brings up future issues when it comes to the game, in that accuracy of these weapons will be very hard to get right, and bug reports will basically be impossible. Due to the current system, without documents proving something, there's basically nothing we can do, even if something is obviously wrong. Due to the fact that these weapons are extremely classified, it's already hard enough, let alone the PL-10 and some others where there's already very little information known. Outside of those issues, the little information I was able to find shows that the PL-10 has a gimbal limit of about 90 degrees, so it will also be very good in a dogfight, and just in general for high off-bore sight shots. It also has a pretty good thermal imaging seeker, so yet again very good at rejecting flares. Other features include lock-on after launch and a maximum range of about 20 kilometers. As for the maximum overload, the only information I can find says it's maybe 60 Gs, however from what I can see that isn't backed up by anything. Personally, I doubt it is only 60 Gs, being a missile that entered service in 2015, and I suspect it is probably closer to 100 Gs like the IRIS-T. Aircraft that can carry the PL-10 are the J-10, the J-11, the J-15, the J-16, the JF-17, the J-20, and the J-31. Note that some of these are only for later variants and not all of them. I would guess that the PL-10 will likely come around the time of the IRIS-T, as it's likely on par or possibly better overall than it. It will almost certainly be one of the better modern IR missiles, especially because it's one of the newest of them all. As for another IRIS-T clone, we have the AAM-5 from Japan. However, in this case, it looks a bit more different from the IRIS-T than the PL-10 does, at least to me, though there is also the fact that the AAM-5 started development a whole 4 years before Germany started on the IRIS-T, so if anything, Germany was the one copying off Japan's homework. Again, this is just another situation where unfortunately there is even less information than most of the rest of the missiles in this video, but again, I gathered all the information I could that seemed fairly accurate. The AAM-5 has features like thrust vectoring and lock-on after launch, which, like many other missiles, allows for it to be used in a wide variety of uses. I'm sure you're tired of hearing this, but it does in fact have a thermal imaging seeker, and this isn't the last time you'll hear this. It has a range of 35 kilometers at maximum, but again, you'll never see this in game really, even under good conditions. As for the maximum G-pull, I've found various claims ranging from 60 to 90 Gs. Personally, I would suspect that it is likely on the higher end, but there isn't any way to be sure. There is also the AAM-5B, which does have better countermeasure rejection, and it also has a longer secret cooling time, but that second part won't matter for War Thunder. The AAM-5 can be used on both the F-15J and the F-2 Viper Zero, which I am very much looking forward to the F-2, and I hope it comes soon. I think that this will likely be one of the better missiles, again likely on par with the IRIS-T. Next, we move on to the mica-ir. This is the IR version of the Mica missile, which the model was actually found in the files recently. As of now, there's no code for it, but seeing as though it is almost the exact same model as the mica-em, which is being added relatively soon, it would make sense to just get them modeled together. The mica-ir will be a decent missile, but there are a few drawbacks compared to many of these other missiles that I've already talked about. One of the biggest drawbacks is that it only has a gimbal limit of about 60 degrees, which is at least 33% less than all of the other missiles I've already mentioned. Another big drawback is that instead of being at least 60 Gs like everything else so far, it's only 50 Gs at maximum. While maximum G-pull isn't everything, when you have half of what the best missile offers, you might start to see a problem. It also has thrust vectoring and lock-on after launch, so these features catch it up to the competition just a little bit, as it also has a thermal imaging seeker to allow for better flare resistance. A big benefit of the Mica over the other missiles in this class is that it has a maximum range of 80 kilometers. Since it was designed to be used as both a Fox 2 and a Fox 3 depending on the variant, it has this impressive range. So it'll be much more like a more maneuverable R27 ET with an even better seeker. The mica-ir can be used on later versions of the Mirage 2000, like the Mirage 2000-5F that we have in game, as well as the Rafale. The 2000-5F can carry up to 6 mica missiles and mix and match the EM and IR variants. Overall, I think it'll be good, but not quite as good as some of the others, but it definitely won't be bad. In a one-on-one dogfight, you won't be able to do as much as others are able to do since you don't have as much of a gimbal limit or the G-pull as them, but it definitely will be usable. I would expect this to come around the time that the AIM-9X comes, as it is much more on that level than other missiles throughout this video. Of course, I have no idea if Gaijin would add a bunch of these missiles in the same update, but I feel like it would make the most sense. Besides the mica-ir, the only other missile on this list that is in the files is the Python 4. However, in this case, it's not just a 3D model, but there's also the code for it in the files. If you didn't know, the Python 4 has been there for quite a while now, since around last summer. The same exact thing happened with the AIM-9M, where it was in the files for around a year before it was actually added to any plane. The Python 4 isn't quite on the levels of most of these other missiles. It has a bit of a shorter range of about 30 kilometers at maximum, so definitely a decent range still. Also, it does not have any sort of thrust vectoring control, however it is still very maneuverable due to all of its control surfaces. It has a maximum overload of 70 Gs, so it'll still be able to turn pretty well. It does only have a gimbal limit of about 60 degrees, so it's a bit less than most of the other missiles so far, but it does also have a pretty good IRCCM, and then it has dual band, similar to that of a Stinger, but not quite as good as the thermal imaging seekers that later missiles have. But again, it'll be a lot better than all the other IRCCM missiles we have so far. The Python 4 can be used on the Israeli F-16s and F-15s, as well as variants of the Gripen, among a few other planes. Overall, this will be a pretty good missile, but at least in my opinion, it won't be as good as some of the other missiles on this list. Especially in a dogfight, I just think at slower speeds, a thrust vectoring missile would be a lot better. Plus, the gimbal limit being lower is a pretty big drawback too. I also think that there's a pretty good chance that the Python 4 comes before the AIM-9X, or at the very least alongside it. Most of the drawbacks of the Python 4 are a result of the Python 5, which is the most recent version. It's essentially better in every way, aside from it also not having the ability for thrust vectoring and still being 70 Gs. However, there are claims that it's able to perform maneuvers that other thrust vectoring missiles are able to achieve due to its 18 different control surfaces. Whether or not this is true, who really knows? There is also the greatly increased ability to point the seeker up to 100 degrees away for off-bore sight shots, which is a pretty big upgrade over the 60 degrees from the previous version. It also has a bit of a longer range at 40 kilometers, which is due to its ability to loft, as it has the same motor as its predecessor. Another new feature is that it also has lock-on after launch capability, so that it can be launched at a target that is in its kinematic range, but not yet at the range of the seeker. Speaking of the seeker, this is another big upgrade. Instead of just a dual band seeker like before, it gets a thermal imaging seeker for even better flare resistance. The Python 5 can be used on the same planes as the Python 4, so it's really F-15s and F-16s among others. The UK's advanced missile is the Azram, which, yes, is similar in name to the SRAM already in game, but this time it's the Advanced Short-Range Air-to-Air Missile. However, this time the range isn't quite as short. The development of the Azram did stem from the original SRAM, and like the Iris-T, the history behind it is pretty complex. The Azram has an impressive maximum kinematic range of about 50 kilometers, meaning it's on the higher end for more modern short-range missiles, and part of this range is due to it having the ability to loft. There are quite a few different blocks, but the differences from what I can see really won't affect War Thunder in any way, so there's no reason to add the different versions, at least from what I can tell. Like others, the Azram has lock-on after launch, a 90-degree gimbal limit for very high off-bore sight shots, and a thermal imaging camera like most other modern IR missiles. Where this missile starts to lack is in the fact that it only has a maximum overload of 50 Gs, as well as that it does not incorporate thrust vectoring like most other modern missiles. I would guess the Azram will be in the middle of the modern IR missiles that will be added to War Thunder. It does have many of the capabilities that other missiles in its class have, as well as better range than most. The Azram can be fired from the British Eurofighter Typhoons, and soon will be able to be used on the F-35. The A darter sounds a lot like the R darter, which is planned to be added to the South African Gripen in the near future. However, these missiles are nowhere near as similar as you might think. The A-Darter is a short-range infrared guided missile that was domestically developed in South Africa. However, as of this video, there do not seem to be any of these missiles that have actually been produced, despite the program being nearly 30 years old. The South African equivalent of Raytheon, Denel, is the company that developed and intended to produce these missiles, but due to other financial issues, near bankruptcy, and many people quitting, the South African Arms Procurement Agency deemed that Denel is no longer capable of producing the A-Darter. Features of this missile include having a maximum range of 22 kilometers, which you may notice is quite a bit less than most of the other missiles so far. Outside of this, it does have a lot of pros that make it more on par with other modern missiles in its class. These are things like having a thermal imaging seeker and thrust vectoring. The thrust vectoring on the A-Darter allows a max G overload of 100 Gs and 50 Gs after the motor has burned out, which takes about 8 seconds. The A-Darter has a lock-on after launch capability, so outside of not existing, really the only drawback of this missile is its range. As for the A-Darter being added to the game, while there were no final production units, there was at least one successful test launch in 2010 and a few more in 2012. From what I know, the only aircraft capable of launching it is the South African Gripen that we have in-game. So in theory, Gaijin could just add it, and they very well may. And I think if it were to be added, at least aside from its range, I think it would be one of the best IR missiles in the game, at least based on the information I've shown. I'll keep this section on the R73M pretty short since there's only minimal changes from the base R73 we have in game. The M variant gets a better gimbal limit for up to 60 degrees off bore sight instead of 45 degrees. It also has a slightly improved range at 40 kilometers, though again you really won't see this. You'll also be able to get better IRCCM on this upgraded variant, though unfortunately I haven't been able to find any information on how much better it is. The R73M can be used on basically every plane that the base R73 can, like on MiG-29s, MiG-35s, the Su-27, and its many variants among other planes. The last missiles we have are the R-74 and the R-74M, which are even more improved over the R-73M. Again, it has even better IRCCM, but unknown how much improved or in what way. It is still only 60 Gs with thrust vectoring like the original R-73, but the R-74 has the 60 degree off bore sight capability of the R-73M, but the R-74M has an even greater gimbal limit of 75 degrees. Both the R-74 and the R-74M have the same range as the R-73M at 40 kilometers, however there is an even later variant, the R-74M2. This brings a longer maximum range of 50 kilometers, which is about 60% more than the range of the R-73 we currently have in game. It also allows for lock-on after launch capability and has a lower cross-section for use with the Su-57. While the R-74M2 still has a limit of 60 Gs, it does seem to have a slightly better turning capability overall than the previous versions. These three variants can all be used on the platforms I've already mentioned, like the MiG-29, the Su-27 family, and then of course the R-74M2 is for the Su-57, though it should be able to be used on other platforms as well. Overall, I've gone over 15 different missiles and or variants throughout this video. They're all a bit different, though many of them have some pretty big similarities. I also think that some of these we will likely see sometime this year, but there are also plenty that probably won't be added to War Thunder for years. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day.